Hello, welcome to the workshop. In today's video we're going to be cutting another dovetail joint, but I'm going to be using this router jig that I've purchased. In the previous video, I'll put a link up here to that, you'll have seen I cut this hand cut dovetail joint, and I used this Veritas dovetail guide and this Veritas Japanese saw, and that was the first ever dovetail joint that I tried, and you can obviously watch the video for that. So again, I want to do the same process, but I want to use this router jig. I want to see how easy it is to cut a dovetail joint with one of these jigs. This is a budget end of the market. There's a lot of different manufacturers that are producing these now. I've never cut a dovetail joint with this type of machine before, so it'll be interesting to see how well I get on. The first thing we need to do is to securely fix this to the workbench. Well, I'm not going to screw this to my nice new assembly table, so I've got this piece of scrap plywood and I'm going to screw this to this and then clamp this to the assembly table. I know that this front edge needs to be over the edge of the bench because your piece of wood that you're going to put a dovetail in needs to come up from underneath to the underside of these fingers, so it needs to sail past the edge of your bench. So what we'll do is we'll clamp this down somewhere where this is just overhanging slightly. Yeah, that's nice and solid, that's not going to go anywhere now. I've just transferred the dovetail jig to my other workbench and clamped it there, just because I can give you guys a much better shot close up with the camera of what I'm doing here. So the first thing to do, I've removed the fingers again just for a bit of clarity so you can see what's going on underneath. Just to give you guys an idea, the fingers would normally be there. So I've taken these off just so we can see. The first thing to do is there's a sliding stop here on the left hand side, and this is what you put your workpiece up against. Now the location of this stop needs to be halfway through one of the fingers. So what I've done with the fingers in place, you can see there I've put a pencil mark halfway along this finger right the way to the back. And then with a square, I can come in here from the back. I'm assuming that the back of the jig is also square, but I can put my square in here. I can loosen this nut and make sure that this stop is square to the jig, and also that the edge of that stop is directly in line with the middle of that first finger. So it takes a little bit of fiddling about getting that lined up, but that's now locked off, square to the jig and halfway through the first finger. The next stop is, this is the stop for the vertical piece of wood. So your vertical board would go in there up against this stop. Now the position of this stop, because these are 1/2 inch fingers on this jig, there needs to be 1/2 inch distance between the two. So what I would do is basically I'd put a mark on one of these bits of wood. There we go. I've come in there, I don't know if you can see that. I've come in 1/2 inch and put a pencil mark there. So I can place that piece of wood up against that stop, and where that pencil mark is, with my little square, I can go up to that pencil mark, and then I can bring this, adjust the nut here, slide this stop in and out, and get that square to the jig and also right on my little pencil mark there. So now I know that there's exactly 1/2 inch distance between this stop and this stop. This stop is centered on the first finger. This stop is 1/2 inch further advanced. And that's really the first major bit of setup with this jig. I put the fingers back in loosely now, and the next part of the operation is to actually get the workpieces lined up. So slide in the first piece from the back, slide in the other piece of wood from underneath. Now this piece needs to be in front of this piece, so this piece needs to be protruding right the way up, and then I'll just use the fingers because the top of this, the end of this board needs to be flush with this top surface here, so that needs to be flush right the way through there. So I'll slide that up until it touches the fingers, making sure it's nice and snug against both the stops and flush here, and then with this handy cam lock just here I can lock that piece in so it's securely held in there now. I can also, similarly with this back one, I can now lock this one down and with that cam just hold that, so both pieces now are in there nice and tight. I'll just put, so this is now flush across the top here. Now to set the fingers up, what they want to be is you want to slide the fingers forward on the jig until they're just 3mm back from this front edge, so roughly about 1/8 of an inch. So 3mm back from this edge, bring the fingers forward until the tip of the fingers just 3mm away, making sure that they're square. Just check that. Okay. So now the fingers are set in position. Now what we need to do is adjust this back stop. This is what the base of the router is going to push up against, so it's going to set the depth of the cut into these fingers, and also the height of the router bit will set the depth of the cut down this front board here. So those two things are the last things we'll set up. For this next bit you need to refer to the manual, and this is to set the depth of the back stop. It's the diameter of my router base divided by 2, so basically half the diameter of the router base plus 2 times the thickness of my workpieces less half the diameter of the cutting piece. I've worked that out, that half the router base plus 2 times the thickness of my wood less half the cutting width is 3 5/8 of an inch. So from the front of the fingers to the back stop, that needs to be 3 5/8, and then I just need to lock that off in that position. 3 5/8 at this end just to make sure that it's square, and lock that off. The last bit in the manual is setting the cutter depth, and it says here adjust the cutter depth until the bottom of the router bit protrudes below the template fingers by 10 to 11mm. Well, which is it, 10 or 11? You know, that's a lot of play, isn't it? With the dovetail bit that they've given us in this kit, in order to have 10 to 11mm of cutter protruding below these fingers and still have this ball bearing riding in the fingers, this bit is actually too long. This bit is 16mm long. So if I only had 10mm protruding below the fingers, this ball bearing would be above the fingers. So that obviously isn't going to work. So what I've had to do is put a 6mm piece of ply in here as a packer, so that now when I put when the router rides on top of here, the ball bearing will ride in between the fingers where it's supposed to be, and I've only got 10mm of the bit protruding into this board. So there's something to bear in mind there, that depending on what bit you're using and where the ball bearing's riding, you may need to make some further adjustments to the position of these fingers. Okay, this is our first ever cut with this jig, so let's give it a whirl. Okay, so here's those two pieces out of the jig, and immediately we can see there's a couple of problems here. For one, I mean, if you look at the profile on those pins, they're not very consistent at all. This one's quite fat, this one's a bit lopsided, and they're going downhill a little bit as well, so something wasn't in line there. Then when we look at this part, the depth of cut is varying dramatically, so something's moved here while we've been using the jig. If I try and put these two pieces together now, obviously they will go together, but there's way too much play in this part. You know, there's massive gaps there. It does kind of fit after a fashion, but then the depth of cut, as you can see, means that this piece can actually sink right in a lot further than it's supposed to. So for a first one, that's pretty rubbish. So I think we've got some setup issues. So we'll reset, I'll get another couple of bits of wood and we'll have another go. Well, I've got some new bits of wood in the jig. I've actually picked a couple of pieces of 3/4 inch. I think this is mahogany, it's a hardwood this time. I've picked a piece of wood which falls, the width of it actually falls between two fingers, because I think that'll give me a neater finish when I come to this end. And then I've reset the jig up completely to match this thickness of wood. And then what I've also done is I've adjusted this backstop. I've brought it forward because the depth of cut last time was obviously way too deep. So it's all set up now. Let's run another piece and see how that goes. That looks a lot better. So we'll take it out and then we'll try it. Okay, so this time it's cut a much neater joint. Fingers are all nice and even. Probably because this is hardwood, it obviously cuts a lot better than the softwood I was using earlier. That bit of cedar was too soft. But obviously immediately they do go in. It's a relatively nice joint, but that depth of cut, I've still got that depth of cut wrong. Last time it was way too deep, now it's too shallow. So I'm going to put these pieces back in, and then I'm just going to, it looks like I'm about just over 1/8 of an inch. I've got to put that backrest further back, and then I'm going to run these pieces again, and then we'll just, hopefully that'll do it. We've adjusted that backstop, we've got the pieces hopefully back in the right place. It's always a risk when you're putting them back in the jig that they're not aligned, but we'll give it another go. That sounded okay. It was only cutting at the back here, so which means it was only nibbling away wood, you know, to affect the depth of the cut. So hopefully this time, third time's a charm. Okay, so here we go. Oh, well, the depth of the cut, if anything, again, I've just gone slightly too deep on that. The fit is very loose. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of play in that joint, even to the point where I can pull that apart quite a bit. You can see there's some nice little gaps in there. So I think it's a case of sitting down with the manual again and just seeing where I need to make those adjustments. But okay, right, we've made a couple of adjustments to the jig. I've brought the backstop forward about 1/8 of an inch so that the cut is not as deep. And I've also increased the depth of the router bit. I've lowered it a tiny little bit because I don't think we were getting down to our mark. So I've actually put that mark at 11mm. Previously it was at 10mm. So I'm going to do a slightly deeper cut. And let's see how this one works out. Little bit of fiddling with the adjustments and settings. And there we go. This one's actually nice and tight. It's finished flush, and the joints, tiny little gap there, nothing major, but that is a lot better fit. So it's taken us 3 attempts to actually get something that's decent and that actually holds together. So I'd say it's a little bit more fiddly, to be honest, first time round, than cutting those dovetails by hand. But once you've got it dialed in, I reckon that would give you really consistent joints. So yeah, not bad for a first attempt. So there you go. It took us 3 attempts to get this dovetail joint to look okay. So it was really fiddly setting up the different parts of that jig. It took me just 1 attempt to cut this hand cut dovetail first time. And although it's not perfect, I'd say on the basis of that cutting them by hand for a beginner was actually easier than cutting them with that jig. However, having said that, I think if you got this jig dialed in, it would produce consistently good dovetails every time. With hand cut dovetails, everyone's going to be slightly different. So it's your choice. Maybe a little bit more work initially, but better results. I don't know. You have a go yourself. I'm going to put all the links in the description below for both videos, and also for all the equipment that I've used. It's not a sponsored video. I've purchased all this equipment myself off of eBay. So if you want to have a go, I'll put the links down there. You can grab them yourself. Hope you found this to be interesting. Show me your support by giving me a thumbs up and sharing this video, and I'll see you on the next project. Thanks very much. Cheers.